Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Relationship and Truth, and today I'm going to be making a response video for one Micah. Now, of course, apologize if I mispronounced that. Hopefully I got the first name right. Not so sure about the last name, but Mr. Micah responded to one of the videos that I put out on YouTube a while back, and most of the time I don't respond to YouTube comments, and especially don't respond to these kinds of YouTube comments, just because as I read through this comment, I don't get the impression that Micah actually this is YouTube, it's videos. I don't get the impression that Micah actually listened to the video in question, and also I don't get the impression that he's meaningfully engaged with any other of my material, or with a lot of different forms of Christianity as a whole. And if you have one side that kind of refuses to meaningfully engage with the other side, it just means that any interaction that you would have just aren't going to be overly useful. They're not going to be meaningful because one side isn't actually listening to the other side and trying to meaningfully engage with it. So most of the time I find those comments really unproductive, and so I just don't really engage with them. There's not much point to it. But that being said, there were a few things that were mentioned in this comment that I felt would be useful in addressing it. Also, just some general characteristics of certain people who are on the non-Christian side of the aisle. I wouldn't say all non-Christians are like this, but there are definitely some people who are on the non-Christian side of things who behave in a particular manner that frankly needs to be called out for what it is. Alright, so without further ado, let's go into the comment that Mr. Micah has offered. Now, to put this in context, this was attached to a video entitled The Myth of Earliest and Best. You can't see the full title is here, but it was entitled The Myth of Earliest is Best, and it was talking about early manuscripts of the New Testament. And the point of the video, very briefly, was that even if a manuscript is really old, sometimes it can indeed contain errors, and through the principles of textual criticism, we can figure out when those errors occur and when they don't. It's not just because it's early, it's automatically right. In fact, there's lots of manuscripts that either at particular places are known to contain some errors, even though they're early, or some manuscripts that just in general are not overly good manuscripts as a whole. An example of a fairly early manuscript that's not overly good would be manuscript D. D as in dog, also known as Codex Bezae. It is one that includes a lot of auxiliary, external, traditional information. A lot of things from the verbal traditions were taken and incorporated directly into the text. And yes, Codex Bezae is a fairly early manuscript. It's a 5th century manuscript. But because it contains all these little additions here and there, and some of them are very random and odd and weird, for example, recording the exact number of steps that Peter went down as he left the prison that he was miraculously delivered from, and things like that. Just weird little additions all over the place. Even though it's a fairly early manuscript, it is not given a whole lot of weight in text critical circles because of the fact that we know its general character and a lot of the problems that are involved with it. It's not automatic that just because something is early that it's automatically trustworthy. That was kind of the basic point of the video. And then sometime later, of course, Mr. Micah here gets on and he decides that he wants to comment on the video. Like I said, I normally don't respond to these kinds of responses, but let's see what Mr. Micah has to say. He says, define what you mean as best. Older is not necessarily best. What do you mean? Does this mean if the earliest examples don't line up with your present-day choice of Bible, they aren't best? What the blank kind of search for truth is that? One of the problems with Christians is when it comes right down to it, is their faith does not always allow them to trust their own eyes. So stupid and cynical a mindset. Bah! Bunch of loose-handed, Greeky, unintegral toilet paper. Stupid Hellenized Jew facsimile smucks. Couldn't even properly copy a manuscript by this time. Word of God? Right. Research through a La La Land lens. Obviously not exactly the highest caliber comments that my YouTube channel has received. There were some interesting points made at the beginning of it, but by the time we got to the end, it had devolved into nothing but name-calling. And that is important to show that when it comes to certain non-Christian groups, and especially those more so on the atheistic side, the idea of meaningfully engaging with another point of view doesn't really exist sometimes. A lot of times it's just easier to dismiss a group that you don't like out of hand, throw in some harsh epithets, and then, wave goodbye as you refuted the errors of the other side, when in fact you haven't really refuted anything, but you made yourself feel good because you got to call someone names. But that aside, there is some useful material here. For example, Mr. Micah asks, define what you mean by best. And by best, we mean the best representative of the original, of course, as per the principles of textual criticism. And the principles of textual criticism are universal principles. They apply to all texts, not just the Bible. They apply to all documents that were passed down by hand at one point or another, for which we have manuscripts, handwritten documents, that because they were passed down by hand, need to be analyzed in terms of possible errors in transmission. This applies to all kinds of documents from the ancient world, some of them fairly boring documents, some of them fairly important histories, but a wide range of documents textual criticism is applied to. And the principles that we're talking about with regard to the Christian scriptures are not any different for these other documents. It's one and the same. Biblical historical Christians such as myself, and unfortunately not all Christians are biblical historical Christians, but biblical historical Christians such as myself believe that if truth is truth, it is going to be true no matter what context into which you're speaking. So if it's true regarding biblical textual criticism, it should be true regarding Roman history textual criticism, and vice versa. That is one of the fundamental tenets in our reconstruction of the biblical text. And if we happen to find, and this goes into the next issue, if we happen to find that we were wrong about something, well then our doctrine and theology needs to adjust to coincide with what was originally given. That's what we mean by best, what is most representative of what was originally given. Now, since we're human and we have human limitations, we don't always know with exact certitude every single thing that was originally written. Okay, we're not infinitely wise, but based on the material that we have available to us, we can usually make very, very, very good assessments. And so the biblical text regarding ancient Greco-Roman literature as general, including the New Testament text in there, and similar things could be said for the Old Testament text. You look at ancient documents, and the Bible is easily the best attested document of ancient history, and it is the one that is the most textually certain as to actually having the original readings survive. A lot of documents that come from the ancient world, we just simply don't have a lot of manuscripts for them. And so it's very hard to be sure that the original readings survive anywhere in any of the surviving manuscripts. But the biblical material is so vast that the odds of something being lost are practically null and void. And this is something that I've talked about in other videos that I've done, but that's something that both believing textual critics would affirm, and also unbelieving textual critics would affirm, such as Bart Ehrman, for example. Bart Ehrman co-edited a book with Bruce Metzger before Bruce Metzger died, or he was added after the fact. I can't remember which one it was, but either way, both of them were associated with this particular work on the history of the New Testament text. And in this work, both of them agreed that the need for what is called conjectural emendation, for coming up with the original, because the original reading has been completely lost and it's not extant in the manuscripts or the other various historical sources anymore. Both Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman agreed, even though two very different sides of the coin, one a believing textual critic, the other one very much so a non-believing textual critic, very much so an atheist, very anti-Christian in a lot of what he says. Even though they have come from two very different worldviews, they both agreed that the probability that material has actually been completely and totally lost from the biblical text, and especially the New Testament, is reduced, in their words, to the smallest proportions possible. Meaning that they admit that there's technically a possibility, but not functionally so, which is pretty significant. Other ancient works simply don't have that because they weren't copied as much. So in terms of actually having the original material available to us, at least somewhere in all the material, the Bible stands the best chance out of any ancient documents in that regard. Unless you actually have an ancient document for which you have the original, and there are some of those that are out there. But shy of that, it doesn't get any better than the Bible. Okay, but like I said, the standard is always what is most indicative of the original. And if you watch some of my other videos, you'll see videos where I talk about the principles of textual criticism and things like that. I've actually have several videos that are on that topic, and we go over the principles and exactly what we mean by our evaluation of what is best in terms of what is original and what is not, and what are some standards that we can use to determine what is original and what isn't. There's actually a series I'm working on right now. Still need to get around to it. I've kind of keep pushing it off, but there's a series that I'm doing right now responding to Jacob Van Bruggen, who basically is of the opinion that what we have now is automatically correct, more or less, and I and several other people have responded to his arguments, not necessarily to him in particular, but to the general kinds of arguments that he's making, and showing that as far as consistent standards of truth are concerned, that he's not being consistently truthful, and because of that he should be ashamed of himself as a Christian. Christians, if they're going to be in keeping with historical and biblical consistent principles, believe in the consistency of truth. Truth isn't one thing over here and then something else over here. A standard of truth is a standard of truth regardless of where you apply it. There aren't a different set of standards of truth for religious matters and another set of standards of truth for non-religious matters. No, it's across the board consistent. And one of the things that we point out regarding Van Bruggen and people who are on that side of the aisle who basically think that whatever has come down to us is automatically correct, one of the things that we point out to them is that their standards that they try to come up with to defend their position on the text is very inconsistently applied. Even down to most of them, they're Protestants, for example, and they believe that the Roman Catholic Church, as do I, that the Roman Catholic Church had fallen into significant error and therefore needed a reformation, the Protestant Reformation. So on one hand, they say, okay, it's possible for God's people to be mistaken about something historically and then need to look to source material to get it right when it comes to how the church functions and doctrines and things like that, but they don't believe it about the text itself. That's inconsistent. Those who are on my side of the aisle say, no, if God's people can be wrong in one area and have received something, have taken something in by tradition that isn't accurate over here, then it's possible that we could take in something that isn't accurate in some other place as well. Just because it's come down to us doesn't mean it's automatically correct. If you're going to believe it in the sense of the Roman Catholic Church needing reformation, then you need to believe it regarding the text itself. Unfortunately, they don't. They're very inconsistent. All right, so what do we mean by best? What we mean is most indicative of what was originally given. And my point in the video, of course, was that older is not necessarily best. That is a fair summary. He says, what do you mean? Does this mean if the earliest examples don't line up with your present-day choice of Bible, they aren't best? I just addressed that. No, that doesn't. Okay, our standard, for those of us who are biblical historical Christians, our standard is not what has come down to us. It's not our present day choices, our present day preferences. It is the evidence of what was original. And the age of the manuscript can play into that, but it is not the only determinative factor. And like I said, I have a lot of other videos on that. If you want, I can provide you with specific links to those videos that go into it in a lot more detail, that talk about a lot of this particular criteria and methods that go into this. And there's also a host of books that are out there, written by both Christians and non-Christians in the field of textual criticism regarding, because there's all kinds of ancient texts, not just religious ones, but there's all kinds of ancient texts that are out there. But if they're useful at all, they're going to have essentially, there's a few different considerations here and there, just because different genres and different treatments of text through history will do different things to them. But by and large, the principles are all the same. So, for example, there are text critical books out there on the Quran. They're obviously not very popular with Muslims for obvious reasons, but there are textual critical books out there about the history of the Quran that do show, yeah, there were changes that were made. Most of them are not overly significant, just like a lot of the errors that scribes made in transcribing the Bible were not overly significant and fairly easy to spot. Those kinds of things happen with the Quran too. Not a huge deal, but they did happen. Upsets a lot of Muslims. And then, of course, there's very secular works, Tacitus, Livy, secular in the sense of non-Christian is what I mean. They're Greco-Roman historians. They're not overly religious in terms of Christianity at all, but nonetheless very significant historically, and there are different versions of them. We have different manuscripts, there are different versions. We need to be able to reconstruct them. And there are some of them we cannot reconstruct at all because parts of them are in fact lost. For example, we don't have all of Tacitus' works. We know that there was a certain number of volumes that he made in certain collections, and we don't have all of those volumes anymore. We have multiple copies of some volumes, but there's some volumes that are completely lost to history. We can only surmise about what they have. And then there's various levels in between. But if you're interested in how textual criticism works and what the standards of originality consist of, what the so-called canons of textual criticism are, you can find that in a lot of sources. If you want me to show you some of my videos on it, I can provide links for you. But I'm certainly not the only person in this. There's been a lot of people doing this before me and in a lot of different fields, not just the Bible. All right. So, no, we don't assume that whatever we have is the best. Unfortunately, there are Christian groups that are out there that are like that. Whatever's come down to us is automatically correct. I already spoke about that with Van Bruggen and folks like that. But for the group that I represent, no, we don't do that. What the blank kind of search for truth is that? I would admit that is a very terrible search for truth if it cannot be consistently applied. That would be like saying that 2 + 2 is 4 on Monday, but Thursday, that's a whole nother ball of wax. I would agree that would be a pretty sad search for truth. And that, unfortunately, is how some people who call themselves Christians represent themselves. Now, ultimately, in the sense of salvation, I don't know if they're Christians or not. Ultimately, that's between them and God. But what I can say is that their standards of truth are not in keeping with biblical historical Christianity. You look at biblical Christians, you look at God's people in the Bible, and you don't get the idea that they assumed that the standards of truth were different for religious things and non-religious things. For them, their entire worldview was encapsulated by God's standards of truth, and they applied to every area of life equally. If you can't do it to every area of life equally, it's not one of God's standards of truth. That's the biblical worldview, and that's the biblical worldview that we try to maintain in this present age. All right, and then he goes on to say, one of the problems with Christians is when it comes right down to it, their faith does not always allow them to trust their own eyes. Again, if Mr. Micah had been interacting with a lot of my videos, he would understand that while that might be representative of some people who call themselves Christians, and maybe even the majority, at least here in America, and certainly is not representative of the people that I'm talking about. Now, just as an issue of technicality, I would bet that Mr. Micah probably doesn't trust his own eyes all the time either. That is, when he watches a magician perform, he doesn't assume that the ball in the magician's hand really disappeared. He knows that it's somewhere. He doesn't believe that the magician really has magic. At least I hope Mr. Micah doesn't. He knows that the eyes can be tricked. But I do find it really ironic that Mr. Micah is making this kind of an assertion, saying that, our faith blinds us, is basically what he's saying. And I would argue that that could be equally applied to a lot of non-Christians as well. I don't know exactly what Mr. Micah's position is. This is a fairly small comment. It's not a whole lot to go on. So I can't speak to him directly, but I can speak to a lot of atheists, for example, and Mr. Micah seems like he might fit in that category. I don't know or not. But a lot of atheists that I know also have a really hard time trusting their own eyes, especially regarding issues of creation and basic existence as human beings and living human beings. That is, never in the history of documented science have we ever observed life coming from non-life through any natural process. We today still do not have observed evidence of any natural process leading from non-life to life. We don't have it. Our eyes are telling us life does not come from non-life by a natural process. We don't have one. It's never been observed. But atheists have faith, at least some atheists do. I don't want to lump everyone in here, and like I said, I'm not exactly sure where Mr. Micah sits on this, but there are definitely a good number of atheists who, because of their atheism, because they believe that God was not involved in the process, they believe that there must have been a natural process that led from non-life to life, even though it's never been observed. They've never been able to see it. Even though their own eyes tell them this doesn't happen naturally, it would have had to have been supernatural by dint of what we've actually observed. We've never seen anything natural that can do this, so it would have to be supernatural based on what we've observed. They reject that, though, because they don't believe in the supernatural. They believe in atheism, that there is no theos, that there is no God. And so that faith, and I'm not saying it's a religious faith, I'm not trying to make them out to be religious in the same sense that Christians are, but it is still a faith. We're going to presuppose that God could not have been a part of this, so we're going to assume that there is a natural process that is out there, we just haven't seen it yet. Christians, on the other hand, are able to see it quite clearly. We've never observed life coming from non-life naturally, which would say that all the evidence points to this not being a natural thing. It must have been beyond the natural. It must have been supernatural. Same evidence for each one. One of them actually trusts their eyes and says, this doesn't occur naturally, so it must not have been natural. The other one looks at that same bit of evidence. We've never seen this occur naturally, but because we refuse to believe in the supernatural, there's a natural process out there that we just haven't discovered yet. Same evidence, but the faith behind it leads you to different conclusions. So I find it really ironic that Mr. Micah is saying that it's the Christian's faith that blinds them to what their own eyes see. Well, frankly, that argument could be made against a lot of people who are in the non-Christian camp as well. And I'm not saying that there aren't some Christians who do some incredibly stupid things. Okay, there are some people who call themselves Christians out there who really do more to destroy the name of Christ than lift it up, frankly. But there are definitely Christians out there who have no problem pointing out the bare facts of what they can observe with their own eyes, like the fact that life doesn't come from non-life naturally. We can see that. And we don't assume that the rules of physics just suddenly change. We would assume that if it doesn't happen naturally, then it has to be beyond the natural that it happened. A lot of atheists, on the other hand, I don't know if Mr. Micah is in this category or not, but a lot of atheists, on the other hand, because they have that faith that there is nothing beyond the natural, there is no supernatural being, there is no God, well, even though it's never been observed once in the history of science or in the known history of the world or even of the universe, by any observable method, it must have happened nonetheless by some natural process. Same evidence, but different faiths lead to different conclusions. We are just fine with trusting our eyes. We've never observed life coming from non-life, which means, at least naturally, which means naturally it didn't happen. If it happened, it had to have been in a non-natural way, in a way that is beyond what we know in nature. Must have been supernatural. All right, beat that one enough to death. Let's go on. Then we kind of get into the name-calling part of it. So stupid and cynical a mindset. Well, there are some atheists that I've known that are frankly pretty stupid, and also, I apologize. I thought that said cynical. It's cyclical, and they're kind of cyclical as well. While we're on it, and even with what we just said, because there is no God, life must have arisen naturally. And since life arose naturally, without the need for any supernatural intervention, well, there must not be a God. They can be pretty cyclical too. I'm not saying that all atheists are like that, but their thinking can be pretty cyclical, and frankly, they can be pretty dumb in what they say. So the whole name-calling thing isn't very useful. It doesn't produce a whole lot of useful conversation. Bunch of loose-handed, Greeky, unintegral toilet paper. Maybe that was supposed to be a description of the early biblical manuscripts. Maybe, I don't know. Have no idea what that has to do with anything. I mean, I guess he doesn't like the look of it. Okay, I don't know what the significance of that is. It's not really an argument against anything. He doesn't like the look of ancient New Testament manuscripts. Okay, I personally am not overly fond of, lots of things. That doesn't necessarily make them good or bad or constitute any kind of a valid argument, but okay. I'm now aware that Mr. Micah does not like the look of ancient Greek manuscripts. Okay. And then he goes on to call Christians stupid, Hellenized Jew facsimile schmucks. Yeah, about that. Hellenized Jew facsimile schmucks. Yeah, again, not overly well engaged in history, because if you know a whole lot about Christianity and what Hellenized Judaism actually was about, you know that early Christians actually opposed the Hellenization that was going on in Judaism. They weren't Hellenized Jews. They were very much so against the Hellenizing trend that had happened in a lot of ways, which doesn't mean that they didn't speak Greek. Obviously, the New Testament is written in Greek. They did. That was the language, the trade language of the land. That makes sense. But in terms of the mentality, not so much. Not so much. That is historically inaccurate to say that. And in a reasonable conversation, in a conversation that actually seeks to understand the truth of the matter, you would need to provide some kind of evidence to support the idea that Christians are just, well, as he says, Hellenized Jew facsimile schmucks. And if you decided to put forward some supporting evidence for that, we could actually maybe have a useful conversation about that. But without any supporting evidence, it's nothing more than a claim. It's no more profound than me saying that all atheists are just gadflies in the ointment. Maybe there's some truth to that, but without actually explaining what I mean by that and providing some further evidence for it, it's not really a useful claim. It's just meant to get people's ire up. All right, and then Mr. Micah goes on and says, couldn't even properly copy a manuscript by this time. No, there are plenty of manuscripts that were copied just fine. And like I said, we have a much better understanding of the biblical text than we do of pretty much any other work of ancient antiquity, especially of Western ancient antiquity. The biblical texts stand far and away above everything else. But this being said, I do have to wonder how good Mr. Micah would be at copying manuscripts. Because most people I know of that criticize the ancient scribes, and by the way, these ancient scribes were not working on just the Bible. There's also, say, the works of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like I said, the Greco-Roman histories, Tacitus and Livy and Suetonius and all these guys. The same kinds of errors that we see in those manuscripts show up in the biblical manuscripts. It's not unique at all. It's not that the Christians were just horribly stupid. There were some Christians that, well, they did do stupid things, and there have been Christians who have done even completely wicked and evil things on the biblical standard. But it's not like, every single manuscript out there was terrible. There were some manuscripts that were made by people who were not overly skilled and not overly great, but still managed to do a pretty decent job even at that a lot of times. And like I said, a lot of people that I've seen criticize the ancient scribes, you give them something, any of the ancient documents to copy, most of them can't get through the whole document without making a single mistake. And personally, I've never seen anyone from the modern age try to copy out a complete manuscript by hand with the same kinds of standards and the same kinds of conditions that applied back then applying today. For example, not being able to use glasses if your sight is impaired, not being able to use electric lights, things like that, having to do things by candlelight, using ink that would sometimes freeze on you and things like that. Under similar conditions, I've never seen any modern person that would criticize the ancient scribes do nearly as well as the ancient scribes did. Frankly, they were far better than you were. And if that's not the case, I'd really love to see you prove it under the same kinds of conditions that they operated under and going through the same length of manuscripts that they went through. Okay. It's really easy to criticize what other people did in a different age at a different time when you're sitting in this nice modern world with electric lights, corrective lenses, maybe eye surgery, and all those kinds of things. And today we have, copy scanners, which are fantastic ways of copying things accurately. But back in the day, any manuscript, not just the biblical manuscript, but any manuscript would have to be copied by hand. And when humans copy things by hand, or when humans do anything, there's going to be a certain amount of error involved. Is that amount of error inhibitive? In most cases, it's not. We wouldn't consider it to be greatly inhibitive in understanding what we do have that survives from Tacitus. We don't have all that Tacitus wrote. We know that we don't have all that Tacitus wrote. But of what we do have, the errors that scribes made, we don't consider that to be greatly inhibitive. And it's the same kinds of mistakes. It's not unique. And the same thing with all of the other ancient manuscripts. People like this, who really don't want Christianity to be true, is ultimately where I think Mr. Micah is at, tend to make claims about how bad or unreliable those things that underlie Christianity are. But in fact, because truth is truth and truth is universal, truth is not limited to particular categories and to particular aspects of life, they wind up throwing pretty much everything else under the bus with it. If you're going to criticize the Bible, then every other work of ancient antiquity from the Western world is going to be in the same boat. And of course, that's pretty ridiculous when it comes right down to it, to assume that we can't know anything about what went on in any period of history with any reasonable level of certainty. There are, unfortunately, some people out there who are like that, and they make a lot of money off of not knowing anything, is what it essentially comes down to. But for those of us who actually live in the real world, who actually want to learn lessons from the past and are willing to admit that sometimes other people did actually understand things better than we do and willing to submit to the wisdom of the ancients, yeah, we're not going to be so quick to throw everybody under the bus. Okay, so yeah, they could properly copy a manuscript just fine by that time. And a lot of the manuscripts that we have from the Bible time, from the biblical record, were made by some very good scribes. And there are other manuscripts that were made by some not so good scribes. But that's the condition of manuscripts in general. Now, in the Bible, regarding the Bible, a lot of the earlier manuscripts, we do have a higher proportion of them that were made by relatively untrained people. That is true, or were very quickly made, but that doesn't mean that they're useless. Just because you get a call from someone for someone else who's standing right next to you, and they're busy, you're taking the call for them, and you hastily write down what the message was, it doesn't mean that because that message was written down hastily and you have some misspellings and whatnot in it that it's suddenly useless. No, that's stupid. Okay, just because it wasn't the best copy in the world doesn't make it automatically useless and meaningless, and means that you can't possibly know what the original intent of the person who provided the message was. You wouldn't do that in any other area of life. Please don't do it regarding the biblical texts. Okay, be consistent. All right, Word of God, right. Research through a La La Land lens. I've personally never seen a La La Land lens. I would actually be kind of interested to know what that is supposed to be. But again, it's just more name calling and not very useful in terms of conversation. So Mr. Micah, I don't usually do this, just because I find that people who provide comments like this usually aren't very interested in having meaningful conversations. But especially these claims in the latter part of your comment, if you have some actually documented evidence that you can provide that would actually support these kinds of claims, then maybe we could have a useful conversation about them. Okay, I'm opening that up to you. If that's something that you would like to pursue, I'll pursue it with you. But if all that you're going to do is just, engage in a bunch of name calling, frankly, I've got better things to do, and hopefully you do too. Okay, because if this is the way that you spend your time, is just calling people names on the internet, then frankly, I kind of feel sorry for you. And what I'm hoping is that maybe there is a side of you that sits back and listens to this and says, well, maybe I don't understand this particular perspective as well as I could. It wouldn't hurt me to listen to it, hear it out. And I might not agree with that at the end, but at least I could listen to it and hear it out and maybe knowledgeably interact with these kinds of people in the future. And that way, when you provide commentary in the future, people would actually be a little bit more inclined to listen to you, because frankly, when I see comments like this, the vast majority of the time, I'm not going to respond to them. I'm not going to pay them any serious mind whatsoever. Okay, just because these kinds of comments don't actually exhibit any reflective thinking, they don't show that the other person cares about who I am and what I actually believe at all. There's not really much point in interacting with people that aren't willing to listen and fairly represent you. And on the same token, of course, that has to go both ways. Mr. Micah, hopefully you've understood that I've actually taken the time to hear you out, read your full comments, interacted with all of it, and obviously I didn't agree with it, of course, but I did interact with all of it and tried to be as fair as I could in that regard. Okay, I'm trying to be fair towards you. I'm trying to be consistent with how I deal with you versus how I would deal with Christians, people in my own camp. I'm trying to be have the kind of integrity that is expected of me as a Christian. Not by outsiders, I could really care less what they think, but expected of me by my God. My God expects me to be consistent, and He expects me to behave with integrity. So that is what I'm trying to do with you. And I'm certainly not perfect, but I'm trying to have a meaningful conversation with you. That's what this video is really all about, is trying to actually bring out some meaningful engagement from you for the benefits of yourself and also for everybody who would be looking at these comments and watching these videos, and actually get to understand what the points of view from each side are, and have a meaningful interaction between the two sides. Because frankly, the name-calling thing, it just doesn't accomplish anything aside from, just all that it does is it shuts down conversation. It really does. If you actually want to speak to us who are biblical historical Christians, you need to show that you're actually engaging with what we really believe. Not just going for the low-hanging fruit, because frankly there are a lot of Christians out there that are complete wackadoodles. I completely agree with you on that one. I think we could both look at a lot of people out there who would call themselves Christians and say, yeah, that's crazy. But that doesn't mean that just because a particular form of Christianity, or maybe even most forms of Christianity, are off, that it means that every single form must necessarily be off. Okay, that is the danger that I see in your comments, is that you want to lump them all together, and frankly, we're not all together. We don't all believe the same things. We don't all have even the same standards when we approach things. Some of us, like I said, are biblical historical Christians and try to be very consistent in applying those biblical historical standards. Others, not so much. And if you're not fair to the people that you're talking about in making the differentiation that needs to be made and separating the groups that need to be separated, well, there's just not any point in interacting with someone who refuses to deal with what is right in front of their eyes. And what is right in front of your eyes right now is someone who is not fitting into your stereotype of what a Christian is. And I hope that you can recognize that. See what is going on in front of your eyes and say, I shouldn't treat this person in a stereotypic manner. I should actually try to understand where they're coming from and respond to that. Okay, so that is my invitation. Maybe you'll take me up on it, maybe not. But hopefully I've done my due diligence on this part of actually responding to your comments and responding in a consistent and meaningful way, and leaving the floor open for a consistent and meaningful response from you. And as long as I can do that, on my side, my conscience is clear. The ball's in your court now, and I really hope that this actually does produce a meaningful and useful interaction. I don't expect that you're going to be on the same side as me. But what I do expect from you, because I expect it of every human being, I expect you to actually take the time to learn about the people that you're decrying in more detail, and recognizing that not everyone fits the stereotype. That'd be really cool. Anyways, for everyone who's been watching this video, thank you very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. But for those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to an understanding of the true Christ of history. Not what people assume later on, but the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.